Welcome. On behalf of the Bloomington Bach Cantata Project, I'm Dan Melamed, Director. Our goal is to present cantatas by J.S. Bach in performances modeled on Bach's own. We're a project of the Bloomington community, of Bloomington Early Music Incorporated, and of the Historical Performance and Musicology departments of the IU Jacobs School of Music. We are grateful for the hard work of our music directors and performers, of our manager, Paulina Francisco, and for this special season, our engineer, Rafael Porto. This project is made possible by generous financial support from the Bloomington Arts Council and Bloomington Urban Enterprise Association, and especially from our generous individual donors. Expenses are higher this season because of the need to present in this way. If you are able and interested in supporting our work, information on donating to the Bach Cantata Project is in the notes below this video, on our Facebook page, and in the concert program, also linked below. Now, this is not how we expected to start our 11th season, but we are determined that Bach cantatas will continue in Bloomington. We'll present recorded concerts until it's safe for us all to gather again. Please consider liking and sharing this video. Help us get the word out about these performances. Now, our routine is always to hear a performance of the cantata, then a short talk about the work, and then a second performance. The second performance is never quite the same. Now, technical requirements mean that we will hear the same recorded performance twice here. But remember that the difference doesn't come just from the performers. It also comes from you, the listener. With what you've heard and the things we've offered to think about, we're confident that you'll hear the second performance in a new way.
Ganze
Today's cantata is Wer sich selbst erhöht, BWV 47. The occasion for which it was composed was the 17th Sunday after Trinity, and that's a pretty ordinary fall Sunday that falls somewhere between the 13th of September and the 17th of October. The author of this cantata text is known. Now, that's not the case for most of J.S. Bach's cantatas. The author was Johann Friedrich Helbig. Helbig spent time as a musician in Leipzig, might have been a student there. He was then hired as a singer at the court of Eisenach by the music director there, Georg Philipp Telemann. Telemann probably had met him during the time he himself had worked in Leipzig, and Helbig succeeded Telemann as Kapellmeister in Eisenach. Helbig was evidently not just a composer, but also a cantata librettist, a poet, and he published a cycle, an entire annual set of church cantata texts in 1720. That was not so usual in the early 18th century for the composer and the librettist of a cantata potentially to be the same person. For example, J.S. Bach is not known to have written any of his texts. Now, every libretto in Helbig's collection has the same structure, and it's a classic. A biblical dictum, a passage from the scripture, aria, recitative, aria, chorale. And that's the pattern here in our cantata. Bach apparently drew on this printed collection, but curiously, this is the only cantata Bach is known to have composed from it. It's from his third Leipzig cycle of cantatas. Bach was at the time without a steady librettist, and he drew on a variety of sources, including a number of published cantata librettos for his texts. The cantata takes its topic from the culminating verse of the gospel reading for the 17th Sunday after Trinity, yet another parable of a wedding feast. And that gospel reading ends with the text of our first movement. Whoever elevates himself will be abased, and whoever abases himself will be elevated. These concepts, elevation and abasement, run all through the cantata. There are many such contrasts in several dimensions. For example, in the second movement, the aria, the librettist puts self-elevation and self-abasement in very specific terms. Self-elevation is represented by Hoffart or Stolz, haughtiness or pride, and self-abasement by Demut, humility. And that's contrasted in the two halves of the text, 3 lines and 3 lines. In the fourth movement, the other aria, there's similar language in the second part of the text. It contrasts Demut, humility, with Hochmut, arrogance. The first part, though, of that aria is not quite as explicit, but it does have a contrast in it. The heart bent to humility contrasted with the one's trifling with salvation. Note that this contrast is made twice in the aria text, not split between the first half and the second half, and that's going to have some very interesting musical consequences. Theologically, as is often the case, the most interesting movement is the middle recitative. It invokes pride and puffery and contrasts it with penitence, just as before. But it also uses elevation and abasement in other senses. Humankind, for example, is dung and earth, but the humble believer will be elevated. The agent of that elevation will be Jesus. Jesus is elevated as creator, but was debased in the act of the crucifixion. So, according to this recitative, the path to elevation is self-abasement. Typically, a long recitative like this one has a trajectory. Here, it's from the first line, humankind is dust or worse, and to the last line, that person will be elevated in God's time. The final chorale stanza, well, there's always some reason a particular hymn verse has been chosen. There's some resonance with the rest of the text, and the significance of this stanza becomes clear in the context of the movements that precede it. It mentions the renunciation of temporal honors, presumably that's associated with pride, implies earthly abasement, and in favor of eternal elevation. And as in the recit for the believer, this is explained as a consequence of Jesus' sacrifice, and that's why the librettist chose this stanza, and that's how I think we're intended to hear it when it comes around at the end of the cantata. The overall musical response to this organization is pretty much as you'd expect. The cantata has a fully scored movement in the same key at the beginning and at the end, using 4 voices, strings, oboe, and basso continuo, both for the biblical dictum, the biblical saying at the beginning, and for the simple chorale harmonization at the end. In the middle is one instrumentally accompanied recitative in which the bass voice sings together with the string instruments. And it has 2 arias with contrasting features. They're in 2 different keys, one a major key and one a minor key. They're for 2 different voices, one for soprano and one for bass. And they use 2 different instrumental scoring. One is for 1 instrument, solo violin, and the other is for 2 instruments, oboe and solo violin. Now, of course, that's not so different in that there are 2 with solo violin. The piece was definitely heard that way in Bach's performance, but maybe also in another way. Here's what happened. J.S. Bach's composing score says that this first aria is for voice and organ solo, and Bach even began notating it that way, in a way that let the organist play from that score. And this came about because the organ was at the time tuned to a different pitch from the rest of the instruments, so to write it out in a way that could be played from at the organ meant effectively to transpose that line in the score. Bach started doing that for 5 or 6 notes and then changed his mind and put those notes back at what you might think of as normal pitch, changed back to normal notation. So the piece was probably not done this way, that was not played with the solo line on organ playing from the score. And we have the original organ part, the part handed to the organist to play all the movements of this cantata, and it doesn't include this solo line. So perhaps this line was for violin, but it's also not in any of the violin 1 parts, either copy of violin 1, which is where you'd expect to find a solo violin line. So who played it in 1726, the year of the composition and first performance of this cantata? We don't know. Now there's an extra leaf with this movement in Bach's hand from a repeat performance around 1742. That was presumably for one of the violin 1 players, playing it as a solo violin line, although it doesn't say. So it was probably heard then as a violin solo, and that's how we'll hear it and have heard it in our performance. So another way in which these aria differ from one another, besides key and voice and scoring, is that they have 2 different musical organizations corresponding to 2 different ways in which the librettist has organized the text. The first aria, movement 2, has 6 lines of text, and as we've seen, the first 3 are about humility, and the second 3 are about pride. This aria is set in 2 distinct parts, with a return of the first after the second, so in units A, B, A, a so-called da capo aria, a piece performed da capo from the top. That was an extremely common way to assemble an aria at the time. Bach makes a musical contrast between these 2 halves. They are clearly part of the same aria, but the second part uses a different kind of vocal declamation from the first, and the second part also uses a different kind of writing for the solo instrument. And this way of organizing the piece with contrast between the 2 parts reflects this aria's treatment of opposition in the text, which separates it between a first half and a second half. The other aria, number 4, has an 8-line text, and as we've also seen, it treats the concepts of elevation and debasement throughout. It's not contrasted in the first half versus the second half. And this aria in Bach's hands shows the other most common way to organize an aria musically at the time. Bach moves through the lines of the text in order. The sentences are treated one by one, the first 3 lines, and then the next 3 lines, and then the last 2 lines. It's unified by musical material, especially instrumental material, the so-called ritornello, that opens and closes the aria and that articulates sections of the aria. Now, our scriptural text at the beginning presents opposites, elevation and abasement, in a very particular way. Strictly speaking, in ancient rhetorical terms, it's an antimetabole. That is, it's a statement that reverses the order of the words in the 2 halves of a sentence. Whoever elevates himself will be abased, and whoever abases himself will be elevated. So it's a kind of antithesis, a very special kind, in which the words and the concepts are inverted. And it's handled in Bach's spectacular opening movement in a particularly effective way. Its musical organization is as a ritornello movement, just like an aria. There are opening, closing, and articulating instrumental statements, the so-called ritornello, and they alternate with texted statements by the voices. This, by the way, is also how an early 18th century concerto movement is constructed, and that's part of the reason that Bach's composing score says at the top, concerto, not cantata, but concerto, which is how this kind of piece was regarded at the time. So the vocal sections of this opening movement are in so-called imitation, somewhat like a fugue. One voice enters with a so-called musical subject, and at its end, another voice enters with that same material. But the first voice keeps going, and with both voices in, they are meant to be heard as simultaneous and arguably equal lines. Then Bach adds a third and fourth voice, each with the same musical material. Now, the way you compose a movement like this is you invent a musical idea, and then you invent a second one that works with it. And when the second voice enters with that musical idea, the first voice continues with your second one that is designed to be heard simultaneously. In this movement, Bach divides the text between those 2 first and second ideas. The first is whoever elevates himself, and the second is whoever abases himself. That means that in Bach's musical setting, they are always heard simultaneously. A voice enters with one, and then as it continues with the second part of the text, another voice enters with the first. This brings out the antithesis between the statements, but it also emphasizes for the listener that these are simultaneously true for the believer. Whoever elevates himself will be abased, and whoever abases himself will be elevated. The 2 texts are combined in this way essentially all the way through the movement until the very end. Now, typically for a ritornello movement, especially in aria, the opening instrumental ritornello is repeated at the end to close the movement, in the same key as it happens, but it tends to be a literal restatement. A choral movement like this one, involving 4 voices, often works slightly differently. The instruments do play the closing ritornello, as you'd expect, but the voices are added, layered on top, and that's precisely what Bach does here. The first movement ends with a combined statement of this material by voices and instruments, and that has an interesting textual consequence. Now, as you probably will have noticed, although the voices treat each other in imitation, entering in imitation of each other and overlapping and presenting simultaneous lines, the ritornello is not constructed that way. It's much more unified. So when the voices are added and effectively sing the ritornello, they present a clearly declamatory statement of the whole text from beginning to end. Whoever elevates himself will be abased, and whoever abases himself will be elevated. And this is a wonderful effect. It's a kind of summation of the whole movement at its moment of musical summation, a firm reinforcement of an idea we can follow all the way through the cantata.
erhöhet.